somebody like 10 more people are going to join, but let's go ahead and get started. Week 10 of our advertising school. This week we have Gia. I just realized that I've never said your last name before. Vecchio? Maybe?
Vecchio. We're so close.
Okay. Gia has a ton of insight and an awesome experience to share with us this week. She was a director of activation at 160/90. She was a VP at The Door. She founded her own kind of communications practice called Foxglove. And she is friends with like a lot of the wonderful teachers that we've already had so far in our advertising school. So Gia, as we go, if there are moments where you want to ask people questions or have people chime in, people will kind of raise their hand on the participants bar over here. I will unmute them as is requested. Otherwise, we'll do all the Q&A at the end. Yeah, and awesome. Excited to hear from you, Gia.
Cool. Thank you, guys. I mean, thanks for having me too, and especially thanks to the people who are doing this late at night and shuffling around their time to make it work. So I think first things first, I like things really informal. So if you have a question, yes, you can raise your hand, but just know that I will let you ask it in real time. And I think it's always great when things are conversational. So a little bit about what we're going to do. I am going to share my screen for you guys in just a sec. And I will walk you through a little bit of a very informal deck, and we'll just kick it off. Let's see. You guys should be able to see all this goodness now.
We got it.
Start with the cover slide. All right. So Foxglove Communications, that is us. Everybody always asks what the name means. That is not a fox, like the cute little animal. It's really a flower. It is the favorite flower of the bees, and you guys probably already know by now that the bees are behind everything. So it's the guy behind the guy who feeds everyone, which is kind of fitting because our specialty / a little bit of a niche for us is hospitality, and that is spirits brands, liquor brands, food festivals, chefs, restaurateurs, cookbooks, you name it. But I've had a lot of experience in different cross sections, which we'll go through in a sec. So that's us in a nutshell. And what we're going to do today is really just walk through kind of who we are as a company, different service lines that different public relations firms offer. And kind of interesting to note is there's really no one size fits all, depending on if you're approaching PR from an ad agency versus if you're doing it from a boutique firm or if you're in-house. Any of those things, it kind of wildly differs what your day-to-day looks like. So we'll go through that, and then I'll kind of run you through very raw, real pros and cons of each experience, and you can kind of make some determinations for yourself on which path feels right for you. And then we'll walk into some of the finer points of like the day-to-day, the bread and butter of what we do, which is the media relations and the pitching side. So you may have noticed in our logo, we call ourselves communications. We do not call ourselves PR. A lot of people just assume or know reputationally that I've come from a background of PR, so they think that we are a PR firm, which means they think that we do all these great things, which we do, and is the core of our everyday, and is kind of a lot of the reasons why clients come and hire us. So everything from external communications, getting press out there into the world. And that means editorial media, as I'm sure you guys know, and really working across all mediums. So whether it's radio, podcast, broadcast, digital news, print news, like ever evolving new blogs, that is all us, as well as like events and image reputation. But I think what people overlook is that there is so much else that goes into PR for it to work these days, which means we are also doing special events, activations, social media. We're developing those relationships. We're doing copywriting, market research, crisis comms, which I'm sure you guys will probably have a lot of questions about as we get to it in a little bit, because I know that is kind of the topic du jour these days in this climate. So we'll talk a bit about that and networking. And then things that they don't make graphics for, some of the other things that we opt into doing as a full service communications firms that not all PR firms do, but really worth noting. We really love to do branding, which I get a little bit from the 160/90 ad agency background. So often clients who haven't opened their restaurant or their hotel yet will ask us to help with everything from naming to overseeing a graphic firm doing the visual identity, helping figure out what the voice and tone words are for that brand, and really kind of top communications internal to external, which if you have the luck to work with a brand from the inception point, gives you so much more control in the long run over how that brand is positioned. So it's kind of like getting it right from the onset, which is pretty great. Brand strategy, because it's really hard to promote and communicate if you don't have a strategy laid forth, especially if you want to be like results oriented and driven, which we always want to do. Business consulting, because we've had over a decade of experience specifically in hospitality. People want us to come in, like we actually get paid to go in and eat a free meal at a restaurant and write up our thoughts, which is pretty cool. I've always found that to be like a very novel part of the job from the beginning, but it's obviously done in a hyper professional way, like everything from the ambient noise that you hear to the way that the server greets you to how you felt about the bathroom. Like we evaluate and assess all of it. And there are colleagues across other disciplines that do this in fashion and other spaces. So that's a really fun part of what we get to do. And it's like, as far as a client will let us get under the hood, we usually will. Content creation and copywriting. This is just kind of born out of all the ways that marketing and PR have started bleeding together. A good publicist, and I will always say this, I hire first and foremost for writing skills above anything else. So if you're a great writer, you'll also be a great copywriter. You'll also be great at content creation. It's just huge value adds to clients and sometimes something we can bill incrementally for, which is great for us. And then there is media training, which is like less sexy and often less talked about. But if you get a really great media placement on the Today Show and you do not prep your client for what that is going to look and feel like, and if they don't feel like ready to succeed and crush that opportunity, then you haven't really done it justice. And if they've walked away from that opportunity feeling like they've embarrassed themselves or haven't put the best foot forward for their brand, then sometimes it's almost like better if you hadn't done that at all. It's definitely like no news can be good news is better than bad news sometimes. I don't believe that all press is good press. So definitely media training and prepping and knowing before you go. Metrics, you're going to hear this. If you pursue a career in PR, you will hear this your entire career is like, how do you measure success? What's the ROI? Notoriously one of the hardest industries to measure success in, because a lot of what we do is qualitative versus quantitative. Like one of the very easy things you can do is circulate numbers of users that go to that website a month or circulation in print. But we all know that print media is dying. We all know that digital is king. We tend to like look at those numbers, but kind of treat them with a grain of salt. It's really more of what things are driving sales. And it requires having a really close client relationship. So if something runs, we'll kind of ask them what was their web traffic the day before, what was their web traffic after it ran. We're kind of looking for those baseline metrics that show a call to action. We'll ask what the reservations looked like before something happened versus right after a certain piece of press hit. We'll ask them, people have called asking about certain things that we've only placed in one specific outlet. So we'll know, okay, if Esquire moved the needle for you, then we should probably lean into more of that in outlets like GQ. And if, Women's Health does nothing for your audience, all right, now we're starting to pick up cues about the demographics that are interested in what you're offering. So metrics, super important for us. You always have to be marketing back what you're doing, because at the end of the day, PR, especially in this climate, is something that is seen as like a luxury versus a necessity for a lot of brands, and can be seen as an expense that you can cut if you don't see the value in it. So it's definitely worth making sure that you're marketing back what you do. It's not necessarily the most fun part of what we do, but it's valuable. And then partnerships. And this part is really great. So while I have this hospitality niche now, when I was at 160/90 and the door, I've worked on everything from Victoria's Secret Angels to the Eagles, and figuring out how to leverage partnerships is really smart. One of my mentors used to say to me, everybody eats, but not everybody loves to read the food section of the New York Times. Like some of your biggest supporters, allies, spenders can be in the business section and the style section. And once you start getting those hits that are in the same routine publications that your core audience reads, you're reaching the same people over and over again. So we always try to think of how can we leverage partnerships in different arenas. So how can we partner up a food person with a local artist, or a musician with a fashion designer, any of those things, to create something that is in and of itself organically press-worthy. It kind of does double duty, makes our job a lot easier, and fosters some of those long-term relationships. Reporting plays really well into metrics. There's great software for that. If you guys are curious about some of the cheat sheets, I can answer that in the Q&A. There's plenty of little hacks and ways to clip and make sure that that is not a time suck, because I like doing the creative work and not so much the analytical work. So wherever I can find that loophole, I will. Social strategy and training. This is again like another way that marketing just bleeds into PR. We've made a decision as an agency that we don't do the community management piece, which for anybody who doesn't know means we will not physically go on their Instagram and hit the post button, but we like to teach a man how to fish. In our industry, it's just so much more effective to be able to give the toolkit and teach someone how to do it and make sure that they're capturing all those spontaneous moments in-house that you can't get when you're contracted because you would miss them, especially while everybody is working remote. It just makes a lot of sense to do it that way. But setting forth the strategy and doing the training means that your client is not bastardizing the beautiful work on their brand that you have done by using like the wrong voice and tone on social. So just make sure that everything kind of ladders up to this cohesive whole. And then therapy, a joke, but not really a joke. One of the reasons I think that we have retained so many of our clients that we've had from day one is because it's really like a trust relationship. And in some ways, people are coming to you to protect and preserve their image. So you're constantly being told things that people outside of the brand, or sometimes even in like the executive leadership of the brand, wouldn't be told, but the CEO will tell it to you because your job is to mitigate risk some of the time and to make sure that you're protecting your best interests. So we treat this really seriously. I've actually had client relationships that have ended, and that former client found themselves later in a crisis calm situation, and I was asked if I wanted to be interviewed for the piece. And to me, that felt like a breach of kind of like confidentiality, whether you sign an NDA or not. You're in a privileged position and people are sharing information with you that they wouldn't have if they had not directly hired you to protect their image. So I think something to note is that you can foster some really like close relationships, and truly it doesn't feel like work in that sense. Like so many of the clients truly become like friends and colleagues, and those relationships have deepened. And then I've even found myself becoming an investor in some of my clients' brands. So I think that's something that we could lean into, and is probably the most rewarding part of what we do. But yes, you have to get ready for some like vent sessions. Any questions on that before I move on?
We actually do have a question on metrics. Adetunji, I'm going to unmute you.
Thank you. That's a great overview, Gia. My question is about metrics. You mentioned anything that drives sales. I wanted to find out, how do you measure when sales isn't the objective?
That's a really great question. Actually, one of the things we do whenever we're pitching somebody is we start off the proposal, like even before we go to proposal, and say, so what are your goals? Like in 6 months from now, how will we have been successful? Some clients identify a dream placement, like they've always wanted to be in GQ or they've always wanted to be in a certain outlet, and then we can measure success that way. Some of them it's reputational and it's tone and sentiment, and we can kind of look and assess that. Some of them it's SEO, and we'll sometimes contract like an SEO expert to make sure the first couple of pages of Google have, you know, maybe they've had negative press in the past and they want to bump that down and get some positive press to replace it. So we really kind of work with them hand in hand to determine what that is. But tone and sentiment's also a really great way to do it. You can pull out testimonial quotes. You can see how you've kind of shifted the dialogue and the perception of how that brand is viewed. But I think that just really goes back to having like a super transparent relationship up front. I always tell clients that they might not like how honest we are, but that they'll benefit from it. So yeah, that all goes to kind of goal setting, but that's a great question.
That's great. Just as a follow-up, does that mean, so you help them set the goals so that you're able to say this has actually been done?
Totally. And I think in some instances, it's a bit of an education process. If they've never had PR before, they don't really know what to expect out of the engagement. So you're kind of helping them shape those goals, to your point. So I usually try to drill down and figure out why they called us in the first place. Do they feel like there's lagging momentum? Do they feel like one of their concepts has energy and the other doesn't? Are they launching something brand new? That's often why people come to PRs, if they're launching a new product or they're opening a new concept and they want to get the word out and generate some good word of mouth. So usually we start with just asking some pointed questions about what their starting point is. And then in the proposal phase, we'll actually put together, hey, based on our preliminary conversation, here's what we think your goals and objectives are, but like, let's align on it before you hire us. So definitely recommend always having that occur in the pitch phase so that you're on the same page.
That's great. Thank you, Gia.
Cool.
I think if I'm reading between the lines here a little bit, and I think this is something that is probably like a trait of Gia's and is probably a trait of like really great PR people generally, but like it's, you know, brutal honesty is so important in like a PR conversation because you're working with people who like, it's not a paid placement. You have to work with folks who it's may not be in their best interest to publish your piece. So there's like a whole network of like the conversations that Gia is having with the brands that she's talking to probably are often like, hey, that sounds really great in your head, but it's not a headline that's going to hit the New York Times.
So much managing expectations. That's really well said. Cool. So again, a few reasons we opt not to call it PR, and you kind of hit on one of them on the head right there. One, it's only one piece of a much larger puzzle. We know this industry is evolving, and the idea that we just mass blast a press release, they call it spray and pray, like we don't do that. It's like it doesn't yield great results. And I think it's a very antiquated way of looking at PR, which kind of dovetails really nicely into the idea that PR has its own PR problem. Everybody in the industry kind of says it's funny what a bad rep PR gets, and all these PR pros can't really combat it. There's just this very outdated notion of what we do, and it's like, you know, it's a female dominated industry and you're all in these tight little black dresses holding a clipboard at the door and telling people they can't get in, and you know, you're cutting off the interview short and you're telling people what they can and cannot say. And like, truthfully, it's so much more collaborative than that. I actually say that if you're going to get in this industry, you're in part getting in the rejection industry, and you have to think of yourself as like a model going on a casting call and know that you're not going to land every single job, but when you do, like, it's a vogue and it's a total win. You know, like, you have to just have your mindset be really resilient and really believe in the people you represent. Like, that's number one for me, and part of why I started my own firm is to really just like champion the kind of people that I want to. I know their character, I know their beliefs, I know where we're aligned. And I kind of like representing an underdog. Like, you'll see, and I'll tell you guys a bit about some of the household names I've worked with, but in some ways it's nice to be the person who's discovered something and like a really amazing story that has not yet been told, and get that privilege and pleasure of bringing it out into marketplace. So for a lot of reasons, we have to look beyond just PR. If it exists in a silo, it doesn't work. And that kind of goes back to the question that was just asked of like measuring success. And if we get a press placement and only the people who subscribe to that publication read it, but there's no call to action, then it failed. If the client isn't leveraging that piece and putting it on their social media for extra visibility amongst their core audience or other people who could see it, then we failed. If they're not taking that, putting it on a press page on their website, we haven't done our job. So basically figuring out how press can kind of come 360 and leveraging it to do more for us. So it's not just an amazing print piece that happened in a magazine issue a year ago that we never leveraged. So value add to clients when they hear communications and know there's so many other things that we can be experts in. That definitely helps give us a little X factor against like the competition, some of the bigger PR firms that say, oh, we don't do that. We only touch like these very core functions of PR, and we stick in our lane with media relations and crisis comms, and all of the ancillary activities really help strengthen the client's foundation. And then they see you as an asset beyond just the person who's the third party pitching. I hate feeling like a third party contractor. Like, most of my clients try to add me to their Slack channels. They try to create an email address if I want one, like a press at whatever the client's name is. And you can say that I probably have no boundaries with my clients, but being in business for yourself and handpicking the people that you want to work with, I prefer that relationship. I like to know what's going on under the hood versus feeling like a third party. And again, that just makes you indispensable as part of a team. And then relevance in an ever-changing media landscape. I'm sure you guys have probably talked about this in some of the other sessions, but it's been really rough out there, even before the pandemic, for our friends in media. There have been some mass layoffs that have been happening. It's going to continue to happen. A lot of print publications are moving to quarterly, or they're folding. They're investing more into their digital presence. So figuring out how to work beyond that scope means your job security, but it also means you're going to work with media in a bit of a smarter, more respectful way as you're asking something of them and they're navigating this really tricky time. So here are some of the brands that I have repped, big and small, bold-faced names, some of which you may recognize and some that you don't. So everything from spirits to hotels to celebrity chefs to brands like Chipotle. But I feel like I have to tell people that this was the good era when they rolled out the Patron margaritas and not the time when they had like all the E. coli problems. So now that that's been said, you guys have a little bit of a sense of my background. Here's how we got there. So Foxglove would not be here if it wasn't for all the experiences that kind of led into it. So my very first career right out of college was for a firm called Baltz and Company, and they are like a very niche specialty boutique PR firm that will only touch chefs, liquor brands, festivals, super niche, super detailed in that way. And I actually like got the bug to want to work on different things, and I felt like if I had only lived in this one silo post college, that I wasn't really giving myself a full spectrum of the industry. So I stayed there for a little over 2 years, piloted a social media arm for Baltz and Company, and was their senior account exec, mostly on the corporate clients. That's where I worked on Chipotle, Allcloud, Williams Sonoma, a lot of those big brands. And then I moved over to The Door, which, funny enough, their first two clients when they had started were Rachel Ray and Michael Jackson. Like, these two founders saw the convergence of food and music and all of those industries way before it happened. One of the founders worked in-house with Rachel Ray, and the other one came from Sony and Epic Records. She worked with Prince. She'd worked with a bunch of great legends. So their whole philosophy was basically take the transferable skills, apply them to different industries, and you'll be stronger as a whole. So I got to work on some really cool personalities there. That's where I worked on Victoria's Secret angels, YouTube stars, at the same time that you're working on meat purveyors like Pat LaFrida, and you're working on brands big and small. So I'd have like a restaurant in Williamsburg and then take a Victoria's Secret angel to a fashion week party. And it's like your day really ran the gamut. But it would be very awful when you came back from a burger tasting and there were a bunch of burgers in the office, and like Gigi Hadid would walk in with her mom, and you'd be like, and I'm done with this burger. Kidding. But yep, totally different kind of experience. And I stayed with them for 4 years, became a vice president for them, and then opened a satellite office for them when their New Orleans division started taking off. Like, native New Yorker with no license, but I was like, New Orleans, pick me, choose me. I volunteer as tribute. Which was a really great experience. And if you ever get the opportunity to kind of do satellite, launch a different market, it's lonely, but I can't recommend it enough. It like really instilled for the first time entrepreneurialism in me. I'd always worked for somebody else up until that point, but then you're that representative of that agency in a market where nobody knows the founders, and your job is to kind of go out there and sell and bring in new business. So that was a really pivotal like turning point in the journey. And then you guys know the whole crew from 160 over 90 at this point. That was my next adventure. When I moved to Philly, I was hired to be a director of activation there, which they did not have an events and activation arm at the time, and they really needed one, and it was really ancillary and complementary to all the PR skills. So we piloted one where we can basically take some of the full service ad agency jobs they were doing and tack on an event project that would start at $250,000. So super deviation from working for like restaurant in Williamsburg for, let's say, $5,000 a month, to ad agency where we were putting together multi-year, multi-million-dollar proposals for universities, for brands like the Eagles, Gore-Tex, Nike, Ferrari, all of it. That was super different for me. So I'm going to like spend a minute on that because it like blew my mind. Like, you're working in tandem with all these other service lines, and you by now in week 10 have probably talked to a lot of experts across a lot of these different areas. But before then, I never had a chance to be the PR person that would then go and talk to somebody producing the $100,000 video spot and the commercial and say, here's how we're going to bring that to market with a press release. Here's how we're going to get ad age involved. Here's how we're going to work with social to blow it up and try to make it go viral, and kind of connecting all the dots. So that was super cool. Or figuring out how activation and events can work with a media ad buy to do something grassroots and experiential and stop people in their tracks versus doing just another antiquated billboard. So 160 was really cool in that way. They had like a media department, a full service video studio, research and marketing, people who were just devoted to kind of crunching the numbers and using that to inform the brand strategy. Every service line you can imagine. Social was separated from PR, events were separated from PR, but those teams kind of worked in tandem. And then did a lot of new business, which helped me launch Foxglove about 3 years ago. And we have offices in Philly and New Orleans. We just maintained a lot of the New Orleans relationships, which were great. Pre-COVID, we were about 15 clients deep, and that a lot of global nonprofits, liquor festivals, spirits brands, wine brands, celebrity chefs, cookbooks throughout New York, DC, Philly, of course, and New Orleans. So kind of diverse and spread out across the country. And it meant a lot of planes and trains. And it's a good lifestyle if you're young and you want that lifestyle. Like pre-COVID, I was probably on the road every single week, if not every other. But luckily, Philly and New York are super close, and that's our main national media market. So quick little Amtrak. But these days, we're all adopting to the remote life. But yeah, that's kind of the little Venn diagram. And, it's not really easy to Venn diagram on Keynote. So you can see the overlap and try to do it kind of true to scale. Any questions on that?
Any hand raises? I guess we're good.
Cool. So I thought it would be helpful to kind of break down some of the pros and cons for you guys. And I don't need to read them all, but I think that you guys are probably navigating these questions in your head. And the one question, or the one bucket rather, that's missing is in-house, because I'd never done in-house PR, which means you work for one organization and they hire you to manage the external comms just for their one organization, which if it's, a restaurant group, you could be overseeing a portfolio of 5 or 20. If it's something like the Thompson Hotels, you can be in a huge corporate team of 50. But in this instance, kind of looking at the vast cross section that I've had, I will say that one of the easiest things for you guys to do that I haven't really dove into yet is kind of the pro bono opportunities. Like offer yourself up to the cause that you're passionate about. I've done that a few times. I had a colleague whose daughter had passed away of brain cancer, and she had been treated at the Sidney Kimmel Cancer Center at Jefferson University. Super small. He was just getting his foundation off the ground. And I said, hey, can I help you pitch this out? And it had received amazing traction. It was the first time he'd gone on TV and talked about his daughter and raised a bunch of money in her name. So that was really sweet, and also helped me foster connections with people in the health and medicine space that I wouldn't have talked to otherwise. During the pandemic, I did a lot of pro bono work in the mental health space. It's a passion area for me, and worked with a local clinician here to just pilot something that would help people who were furloughed in the hospitality industry have access to free private therapy sessions, free group webinars, etc. And it was something that not only did we get great coverage on, but then Food and Wine asked to cover me in their July issue. So that was cool. And I usually hate being on the other side of the publication. I like being in the background by nature of the job, but things like that definitely can help bolster your resume, your portfolio, but it also teaches you what your passionate areas are. It opens doors. Those people refer you for people who can be paid contracts. So I would say one, that's a great place to start. As far as the niche and specialty boutique area, I loved it in that it helped me find out what I loved. I didn't know how much I loved restaurants, hospitality, etc. And obviously I branched out later in life, but then came back to it for a reason. So if you do feel really strongly like you know what discipline you want to be in, if you live, breathe fashion, it's all you consume, then maybe that kind of an agency would be a great starting point for you to feel out if that's truly where you want to be with your career. Generalist on the other end of the spectrum for that, I found it had like very little structure, because you would go from a celebrity to doing a mom and pop in the same day, and you have to shift your brain to shift gears, and there's already a lot of multitasking that goes into all the different things that we do. But if you're competitive, you like a fast pace, and you want to get as much experience under your belt in a very truncated period of time, it's not a bad way to go, because when I look back at the clients that I'm really proud of having worked on, or when I really want to illustrate my range of skill sets, I think back to that time often. And they generally let you be a little more entrepreneurial if they're on the small side, like the sub 50 employee side. That said, I wished I'd landed at a full service ad agency kind of first and foremost. And I'm guessing since you guys are in the advertising school that you might feel a little bit of the same way. For a first foray into this kind of a career, being in like a large collaborative setting, even if it's remote during COVID, is you can't really compare to that. Like the relationships you make just take you super far into whatever you're going to do next. But the exposure to the different service lines for me was like the real game changer, and learning different skill sets and how PR plays with those skill sets, because then you can kind of go on to do anything. You understand how your job benefits a web team. You understand where you interface with a media buy, and you kind of know what your swim lanes are, and you know which ones you want to stay in and which you don't. So that was great. It is a little more structure than I generally like as a creative, but I like to think that you should start with like the most structure, and then you know what layers you can peel off later on in your career. So those are my thoughts on it. Pros and cons to all. There's no wrong way to start. But that said, highly recommend people go agency before going in-house or out on their own. And the reason for that, and it's like not often talked about, is really the shared network. When you're in a bigger agency, you're all forwarding leads to each other all day. Like Wall Street Journal is looking for people to opine on COVID business shifts that entrepreneurs are doing, or want entrepreneurs that are moms to share their favorite XYZ. And you get all those inbound leads tossed to you. So PR works in like multiple ways, right? Like the outbound pitching, but also the inbound leads that you can then leverage. And when you can back end into a piece like that, like it's much easier to get in the Wall Street Journal if you know what they're writing about and you have a client that directly fits into it, versus pitching that kind of a story from scratch when you don't necessarily have those relationships baked. It's a really good way to leverage the kind of dangle the carrot of the agency names, whether you work on them or not, is like, hey, I work for an agency that has the pleasure of working with everyone from Gigi Hadid to Aaron Sanchez. Can I take you to a coffee, tell you about our clients, would love to find a way to work with you. And you should definitely hit the ground running on trying to meet as many people as you can, even if it's for like a Zoom coffee. That's how you really form those meaningful relationships with editors. And I think that if I had started on my own or in-house, I wouldn't know which relationships to leverage or have those skills. So I feel pretty strongly about that. You guys know this already. Offer yourself up for free, whether it's an internship or pro bono. It's low risk and you get to hone in on what you like and what you don't like. And then, yep, generally speaking, the bigger the firm's roster, office, and service offerings, the more structure you get. So pretty straightforward there. Any questions? Easy crowd.
How have you ever survived in a PR agency?
Is that the question?
I'm just kidding. That's my question. I had a brief stint in a PR agency. That's the start of my career, and it was overwhelming. Like the amount of emails, the amount of requests, like the coordination between people. It's madness. But I learned so much. So I fully agree with what you're.
It's super fast paced, and honestly, I think the only reason I survived is you have to figure out what part of the job like is great for you. And I can't tell you how many publicists I've met who are like, yeah, I like the job, but I hate the pitching. And I'm like, what do you mean you hate the pitching? For me, the pitching is everything. So maybe that is why I'm like a decade later and I'm still here. Maybe I like have an appetite for like getting rejected, and then finally when I win one, I'm like, yeah, you bought my story. But I think that it really just depends. And I feel lucky because I think I have clients that are like trusting enough to say, cool, what do you think we should be doing with our programming? And should we throw a party on the roof? And like any crazy idea I've had, some clients let me fulfill it over the past decade, like Willy Wonka style challenges, like you name it. So this is for me, see, you led into that perfectly. It's as if you knew. This is the fun part of the job to me, is the pitching to media across all different mediums. And there is an art to it. And I think that there's some shortcuts you can take, but the truth of it is you have to read a lot. Like you cannot pitch if you do not like to consume the news. And I have to say, I'm really impressed with this group because you guys all opened up by talking about different ads and media you were consuming. And that is half the battle. My first PR job, I was an assistant at first to the president of the agency, and I was the only person who this rule didn't apply to. Everyone had to come in and read the papers in the morning. So he would subscribe to every single paper and it would be put on a conference room table. And you would go in there and just whenever, with your morning coffee, first half hour of the day, was like you read the Times, you read the Journal, you read it all, you consume things, you make notes, you figure out what you want to pitch. And I remember like a month or so into the job, my boss comes out and he's in a tear. He's like screaming at a decibel that I can't even imitate for you if I wanted to, let alone there's like a toddler in the next room and I don't want to wake her. So he starts screaming like, Marion, get off your ass. You haven't gotten a hit in a month and I don't see you reading the papers. And I'm just sitting there all of 22 years old, like shaking. So now every day I get in at 8:30 and I get in there and I'm reading the papers. And like on the 7th day of doing this, he comes in there and he goes, you know, that rule doesn't apply to you, right? But like, if you want to read them, that's fine. But like, as my assistant, you don't have to. So every day I kept showing up at 8:30 and reading them, and that meant that 2 months later, he gave me a job working on accounts. So long story short, read your papers. And then really ask yourself before writing a pitch, and not a press release, which I'm sure you guys have seen, or a media alert. Honestly, what they don't tell you is like 9 out of 10 times the most effective thing is writing an email, like a really thoughtful pitch letter email, targeted, customized to the one person that you think is the right person for this story. That doesn't mean there's not more than one right person for the story, but everyone getting that email needs to think that it's not a mass blast and that it was designed for them. So I always ask myself, why the story? Why right now? And then, kind of to the point of managing client expectations that came up earlier, is this better alone or as a trend piece? And this is your job as a publicist that's kind of in direct conflict with the client's like wants sometimes, because if you ask a client, they want everything to be a standalone feature on them. But as the expert, you know when something's going to sell as just them. So you could either place it as just them if the story's big enough. But more times than not, that story's going to sell if you can prove that there's a big national trend there and it's not siloed to your client, especially if you're trying to pitch a national big whopper hit in like the Wall Street Journal off-duty section, or you're trying to get a great segment. The story's stronger when you have a bunch of national examples to round it out. And that's really where you guys end up making the judgment call and doing the legwork. And your job's not just to keep the client happy. If at the end of the day, you think your job is to keep the client happy, you failed. Your job is to keep the client happy, to keep the media happy, to preserve relationships on both sides of that, to make the media think you're a resource for them and that you provide access to things that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And I found that writers really love me when I'm like, they send me a lead and I'm like, I don't have a client that fits this bill, but I have heard of these 3 other people and I actually know this one person and I'd be so happy to get you in touch. And it's kind of like doing that when there's no possible gain in it for you. We'll definitely come back around and give you some good karma points later. And it's also knowing, like, I have a client that opened a grocery market inside their restaurant to help people during the pandemic. And they want to see that national business piece told. And I know that if I try to do it just about their one market, when I've already heard of 5 other examples happening around the country, that it just won't happen. So I go into a Facebook group of a bunch of other publicists that I love and work with in the industry and said, hey, do any of your other clients, they have markets cropping up that they're putting in their flagship restaurants during the pandemic? And then we get 5 examples nationwide that are really strong. Some of the names are more celebrity than my clients and some are less. So you round that out and you make it a really strong trend piece, you're going to get the story placed versus not getting it at all. Also, don't bury the lead. Almost every intern we have, it's like the pitches go on way, way, way too long and you don't know what the ask is. And I am not joking when I say these journalists, if it's a great writer, they get upwards of 200 pitches a day. So definitely don't play shy and coy. It like all goes back to being transparent with the clients and transparent with the media. Like, what is the ask? And that goes into like knowing your audience, which I always say, like, yeah, if you haven't read that publication, like if you don't know that this pub is a luxury outlet catering to a luxury audience, you're probably going to mess up the pitch inadvertently and like, and not tailor it to what that readership wants to hear. And therefore the writer won't see how it fits because they're always thinking about their audience. So while that is important, I have become the master of the stalk the writer. So if any of you have ever like stalked an ex, and I know you all have, this is going to come really easily to you. It's basically like, if you don't know that writer, get on their Twitter, find out what their dog's name is, find out what like mental state they're in right now. Are they moving? Did they just get laid off? Are they happy? Are they celebrating an anniversary or a honeymoon? If you can start off the note of like, hey, I just saw that you were on your honeymoon. I love it in Colorado. I go there every summer. Not sure if you're back in the office yet, but I wanted to float this by you. Or, hey, I read your amazing piece on markets in the Wall Street Journal off-duty section, and I thought you might be interested in restaurants converting themselves into markets. So that's already established that you know who this person is, you care about them as an individual, you know what they're writing about, and that like always reaps better results. Short and sweet. I've seen people land like 8-piece features using a 3-sentence pitch that just like gets straight to the point, and then you follow up with the details once they're hooked. Sometimes, depending on what you're pitching, you're going to need more meat than that, but it should never feel like an essay. It should never be more than like 3 paragraphs long at most. Like, bait them in. And then once they're interested, you could give more information and start a dialogue. Otherwise, it just feels like you're clogging up their inbox and you get the TLDR. Making sure that the story hasn't been told. Like, do your research, go on Google, check what that writer's written. I know so many people have just inadvertently made that mistake. Knowing the timing, that timing is everything. If there were so many stories that during, BLM and the social justice movement, that we made a conscientious effort and a very deliberate choice to tell clients, go silent these 2 weeks. I know you have important news. I know everybody's business is affected by COVID, but there are bigger things happening in the world right now. And one, it will come off as very tone deaf, even if the story did come out right now. And two, I think a lot of journalists are being rocked by this as well. And I just don't think it's what the world needs right now. And you have to kind of be that expert and guide them through the climate. And that means just keeping your pulse on the climate. This one a mentor taught me, and it's a really good lesson. Sometimes people pitch a story so well that it can be told without their client. They've just sold the angle. You need to make sure that you're also selling why your client is the only one who's so uniquely poised and the expert to talk about that, and leaning into their credentials, and then not being afraid to follow up. Not saying, hey, making sure you got the below, but saying, hey, I also saw you did this other piece, or hey, I actually got another stat that could be useful for this angle if you were into it, or hey, I haven't heard back from you, but I would love to send you this cookbook if you're open to it. Send me your mailing address. So something that has some kind of substance and follow through. Anything on that before I keep it moving?
Easy crowd.
Easy crowd. Media pet
peeves.
The media pet peeves. Okay, so these are real, and people will bitch you out if you pitch it the wrong way. So if you didn't read their content, they will write back and be like, I don't write about this. Take me off your list. TLDR, you want to keep it short and succinct. The topic's already been covered extensively. You have a great angle, but it was a great angle 2 weeks ago, and now it's infiltrated their competitors' outlets and other outlets. It isn't the reporter's actual beat, which means sometimes people will go on Cision, if you guys have used it, the software that basically pulls email addresses based on a very high level search. So you can be searching, I want everybody who covers alcohol and spirits, and something can be an AA outlet, and you could be pitching a cocktail recipe because you didn't do your research, and somebody will write back and be like, that's not my beat, I don't cover that. Or it's just not a fit, it's the total polar opposite. Or you're pitching a business reporter a story that really belongs in leisure. So just knowing who does what at each outlet, making sure the angle's not buried. Typos. You're writing to a writer. Even though it's an email and it could be a little more informal, they will automatically dismiss you in most instances as not being professional or not being a trustworthy source if they think that you can't string a sentence together, which is why I always say I hire for writing skills. Writers love a good nerdy written pitch. Supporting assets. More than anything right now, having the right imagery, and it's been so hard during the pandemic, but having imagery, the right access to talents for what you're pitching, and statistics, especially if it's a business piece, are kind of the things you need to get the story sold. It's not just enough to get the writer interested if you can't follow through on what it needs to make print. So we actually do a lot of working alongside photographers and working alongside our clients to make sure, is the photo horizontal? Is it 300 DPI? Is it fit for print? All of those things. So even though you are not signing up to be a photographer and that's not your job, having the right imagery, that's really what dictates what makes it in the magazine sometimes. So having that will be helpful. Different kinds of pitches. I think you guys know this, so I won't belabor it. Featured story is the creme de la creme. Your clients all want it. It's all about them. It's the deep dive. Breaking news, for example, people that are closing during the pandemic, people that are opening new things right now, anything that feels timely. Often this is where you offer an exclusive to somebody in your region if it's a market specific kind of opportunity. It's usually the thing that's more finesse, that you have a complimentary social media statement and you kind of orchestrate the whole sequence of when things go live. Trend piece is more often than not, I love it. It's what gets us the most national traction. It situates you amongst great companies. Sometimes it allows you to put your client next to names that are one level above where they are and where they see themselves and where they want to be. So definitely love, love, love the trend pitch. Business pitching is a beast. You have to really have your numbers there, and you have to know, and clients can kind of be cagey about numbers depending on the industry and whether or not they're privately held. There are definitely ways around this, figuring out, and right now there's so much interest in women who balance, motherhood and balance entrepreneurialism. That's always a hot topic angle. How businesses are effectively switching to remote, how they're implementing new tech to keep their employees safe right now. Anything that's like thought leadership falls into this bucket, and some of those softer categories allow you to stay away from numbers. Broadcast, I love and hate broadcast so much, guys. Local TV, it's like they book you the night before. The anchor forgets how to pronounce your client's name, even though you've done phonetic like spelling. If you really want to watch yourself get anxious, like do a bunch of broadcasts in a week, but it is so damn effective. It's annoying. If a client goes on broadcast, like you hear about it from people on the street, like, I saw you on ABC, and it definitely moves the needle. So it's worth it. But it's definitely nice to have somebody kind of coach you through that, or shadow like a senior colleague in the early days, because you have to be so aggressive on these shoots sometimes and be like, can we do another cut if it's not live? And you have to be the person to interject, whereas sometimes you're a little more hands off. And then really popular in the pandemic, and I've probably worked on it more since March than I ever have in my career, are the op-eds and the as told to. And I think people are really interested in firsthand accounts right now. And usually I pitch the idea first before making the client write the piece, and you get the word count, and then you work with them as they write it. And it's kind of cool. You guys have co-authored something together that ends up having their byline. So those are the different kind of pitches. Now I got an assignment for you guys. Are we ready for assignment time? Yeah. Okay, cool.
Let's do
So
it. The
I
best
sit
part.
on the. All right, this should be a fun one. I sit on the leadership committee of Independent Restaurants Coalition. So that was founded by some names you might know, like Tom Colicchio, who's on Top Chef, and Will Guidera, who founded 11 Madison Park, and a bunch of great names are involved. Jose Andres has led his name to the cause, Thomas Keller, kind of some of the greatest celebrity chefs you can think of nationwide. And what they are fighting for right now is $120 billion stimulus, essentially called the Restaurants Act, which is designed to save independent restaurants. So really separate from what the NRA is fighting for. The NRA is fighting for, and there's overlap, right? Like they want relief for their restaurants, but their restaurants include McDonald's and Chipotle and a bunch of other chains. And this organization is really fighting for small independents to survive, and basically providing more grant relief to this industry, which has been uniquely decimated. Like 11 million people stand to lose jobs. We all know how much is at stake, and I'm sure you guys have seen it all over the news. So actually today they dropped a really cool TV commercial spot with Morgan Freeman. So as you guys are digesting ads, you might want to check that one out, which is on the Save Restaurants website. But essentially, I want to see if you guys can show off what you've learned about pitching and figure out how you can help this organization as it fights for this $120 billion bill in this very saturated climate when, hotels and airlines and everybody else are looking for the government to help them right now. How can we use emotion to elicit a response from a writer, from a producer? It could be any medium. It could be a podcaster, writer, producer, anyone. And how can you work with them to make them want to amplify this message? So what I'd like you guys to do is identify your specific target, find a name of a person and their outlet who hasn't already covered, which is tricky because there are a lot of PR people working on this. There are people like me who are just helping out regionally because they care. Boltz & Company, the firm I came from, is doing some national Epicurean work on this. And then there's a group called Precision, which they're amazing. They're a political PR firm out of DC, and they're doing a lot of the lobbying PR on this. So essentially, you're going to see there's been a lot of coverage, like Axios, Politico, Food and Wine, you name it. But there's still many more places to blanket it. And I would give you a little bit of a hint and say that I don't think nationwide all of the high like regional markets have been saturated, and there's definitely more room for like regional market saturation, especially considering that right now what they're trying to do is get more members of the House and Senate to sign on and support this bill. They have a lot of co-sponsors right now, which is super cool, but now is kind of the critical stage to make it or break it. So would love for you guys to identify who you'd want to pitch and then craft a custom pitch letter. So remember, not a press release and not any kind of alert. Basically like 3-paragraph max of who you would target. Think of everything from the subject that you're going to use to catch their attention, which is like huge because the subject in the inbox is either like I'm opening this or I'm deleting it. Think of the target name and outlet. articulate why the story needs to be told right now. What's your specific ask of that outlet? Is there a column that you want to see this in? Is there, you know, is there a specific Q&A? Are you asking for an op-ed? Basically leverage the talent. Like, this is a fun game of pretend. Pretend that Tom Colicchio will do any interview you want, which he probably would for this, or Jose Andres, or any of these other folks. Leverage them, offer them up to tell the story. You can find out their names on the Save Restaurants website and have fun with it. Mostly, I think it should be really fun, really easy, and it's honestly, I thought of a lot of different assignments for you guys, and sure you can add like a press release or a media alert to your portfolio, but like if you really do want a job in this industry, 8 out of 10 times you'll be doing a little pitch letter, unless you're working for somebody really corporate like a pharmaceutical company that wouldn't want you to put out anything unless it's a legal press release. So unless you're looking to do that, this should be really good hands-on experience for you guys. And that is kind of the homework. And that leads us to the Q&A.
I want to just clarify 2 acronyms. One Adetunji called out in the comments. IRC is an independent restaurant coalition, and the NRA in this context is not the NRA, National Riflemen's Association. This is the National Restaurant Association.
Exactly.
There were 2 moments in your talk where I like want to just pull some things out, because I think these were things that like are super important lessons that, like, you know, we've heard in different ways from a lot of our teachers so far. You told a story about how I think you were an assistant at one company, and because you showed like, I'm hungry to do that, they moved you into another department. I've had that experience. A ton of my colleagues have had that experience. And I feel like that is like so a make or break moment in a first job, that, like, you know, whether or not you start in the discipline that you want to like land in eventually, that you find a way to prove to your boss in whatever role you have that you are someone who is hungry to succeed, even if it's not here, that you are an asset to the company. I just wanted to like kind of like call that out and see if there was other kind of like advice that maybe you have for people who, you know, like right now is not the best job market for anybody, let alone people who are just graduating. I imagine that you're gonna have to make a tough decision about like taking a job that may not be the dream job. How can people kind of like take that opportunity and turn it into the dream career?
That's a great question. And honestly, I'm going to sound super old when I say all these things that like our parents or grandparents at this point have said to us. But you're right. It is a super, super tense job market. And I would say like get the job at your dream company first, and then worry about getting the dream position later. I think if it's the right organization. And also, if you don't see the job listing, like, don't be scared to cold email somebody. Like, there have been so many times where a job didn't exist and a company created a position because they were big enough or in a position to do so and you were the right fit. And obviously you might get a lot of no's that way in this climate, but you truly never know. Or you might intercept somebody a day before the job listing went live, you know? Like, there's so many instances of that. But yeah, you really have to stand out. I would say, like, break the rules a little. Like, who says your cover letter has to be formulaic, and who says you have to like work off of a template you found on Google Images and then like just adjust the text to fit what you think that the person wants to hear? Like, evoke passion. When somebody's shown that they've looked at my website and they ask for an internship, or they follow work we've done on a certain client, or they've read a certain piece of news we've gotten a client, I'm more likely to give that person my time, even if it's just an informational phone call, even if I don't have the position available. Like, you're making that connection. And like, you can't be precious with your time when you're looking in this climate. You have to, like, any call you can get with somebody is great. Never ask to pick their brain. Like, always lay out what it's the same thing. You're pitching them for their time and they're busy CEO or executive. It's like, what do you want to get out of that conversation? And maybe like structure it a little, not like provide a formal agenda, but tell them some of the things you've been working on and some of the things you've noticed they do and you would love advice on, like things to get in the door. Once you actually have gotten in the door, like, yeah, you work for the job you want, not the one you have. I would come in on Sundays. I would come in at 8:30 to read those papers, and definitely would not leave at 6. And it sounds so antiquated, but the first couple of months I wouldn't leave my desk until I knew my boss had left. And that doesn't work every night, and it doesn't work for every lifestyle. It's not one size fits all, but if you do have the kind of luxury of the lifestyle that affords it, putting in those hours now means like I am all of 30 years old, dating myself, and get to create my own schedule now. So like, yeah, I was grinding it out for a decade, but now I can decide when I want to leave early and when that works for me. So it does pay off is what I would say. So put the hustle in when you're young.
Yeah, that's so funny. That is like an old piece of knowledge that I feel like it's still got some ugly truth to it. Like maybe it's not like don't leave, like, don't wait till your boss leaves every day, but like don't leave at 5 if your boss stays till 8 every night. Like don't be that person.
But don't leave at 6 on the dot or like 5:59 and I hear you rustling with your bag. I'm like, I know you've just been spending the last 20 minutes planning your exit route. Like definitely at least be a little subtle about it, or show up on Slack. Like if somebody leaves right on time, but they Slack something an hour and a half later that they thought was like a great article that I should see or a client hit, that's always appreciated. And sometimes like send an idea to a colleague for an account you're not on. The reason, like in part, that I had gotten that promotion was not just because I read the papers every day. It was because my boss didn't know how to have an assistant and I was wildly underutilized. So I started pretending I was an intern and going to different partners in the firm and saying, hey, do you have anything you need me to work on? Like I'm kind of light on my load for Phil right now. Like what can I help on? And would just volunteer myself for extra work on like accounts I didn't work for. So like don't be confined by your job description. In the same way that I'm saying if the job doesn't exist, still ask for an interview. If you have the job, don't just think that that's like the buck stops at your scope of work.
Totally. I forgot to ask you to unshare.
Yeah, I can do that. That is helpful. And then we can kind of go into Q&A. There we go.
I've got...
I can see everyone's faces again.
Not just mine. Avisha, I'm going to unmute you for your question.
Thanks, Gia, for your very insightful presentation. So my question is, what should be done in case the brand image of a company is really affected badly? So I interned with a company recently where a few years back, they got into some financial regulation trouble and their shares fell down, and it's been 3 years to that incident, and they were proved not guilty, but still they have that image of being unethical, and their shares have never been able to rise. So
Yeah.
just out of curiosity, I was thinking, what should be the process and how should they work around this?
That's a great question. I mean, in their instance, it sounds like the damage has kind of already been done. And some of those instances, if we can see where there's a weak point, or if we kind of suspect that there's something that's not above board or going well in the company, I usually try to take it head on, and I'm always trying to proactively protect the person if I think something isn't working. But then there's also knowing when a certain thing is beyond your pay grade. So if there's like a crisis that's bubbling, I'll usually know if it's coming down to legal terms or things that could be filed as public record. That's usually the big indicator for a publicist. If there's like a lawsuit or something that's going to become public knowledge, getting ahead of it. And usually at that point, you would like get the lawyers involved. Sometimes you would hire an outside crisis comms professional if it's not in your direct field of experience. There's like trainings you can do, but if you're somebody like me who does a lot of lifestyle PR, chances are you haven't had extensive of like HR training in some of these areas or some of the financial disciplines. So you would kind of hire a pro and work in tandem with them. One of the things, and I'll give you a little anecdote of it, is we work with a cocktail festival that's global, and the past ownership, and I'd never worked with the past ownership, they stepped down for racial insensitivity. And then 3 years ago, new leadership came in, converted it to a full 501c C3 nonprofit, but they still had that reputational struggle, right? Like the old ownership was known for not being good people and for making some pretty poor decisions and not being inclusive. And the new leadership did a lot of things right in those 3 years that kind of went unnoticed. They'd hired a 24/7 hotline. So when you were at this festival, if somebody was inappropriate, you felt unsafe, there was any kind of harassment, you can call it and it would be investigated by a third party. They offered anti-bias like trainings. They had all of these free programmings for like mental health and wellness. They did all the right things. So for my job, it was really more of not being scared to talk about the past. And luckily for them, they weren't a part of that negative past. They really were trying to move it forward, but they also didn't want to shit talk the people who came before them. So it was kind of saying, you know, we weren't there during this era and we can't speak to it, but we do want to tell you what we're doing now. And we realized these were weak points of this organization before, and like, here's the path forward. And I think that's what people want in this climate, is like a lack of BS, transparency, and accountability. So I think if you're willing to kind of, people want you to show your cards. And if you're willing to be vulnerable, you're not going to get nailed to the cross. But I would also say, know what your professional limits are. Sometimes you want to save the client and save the day, but in the instance of that client who the damage has already been done, I would say they need an SEO expert. So I'd probably hire that. I would get some great press to bury the bad press and make sure I'm working with SEO so that those search terms bump it up to the top of the findings. And it would probably make them do at least one really vulnerable interview with a journalist we really know and trust, to kind of be able to talk about that, but then move on from it. So if people ever want a statement, it's out there, but they don't need it to be their entire future.
Right. Thanks a lot.
Great question.
Just a freebie corporate recovery plan. Love it.
I mean, that's honestly, mitigating risk has become like the bulk of our jobs lately. And there's so many tensions flying high right now. Aside from social justice and COVID, there's all these employer-employee tensions. There's so many factors to think about. And I think everybody rightfully feels really sensitive in this climate. So I think like empathy, honestly, if you can be a publicist that puts EQ first, you are going to do really well in this field.
Yeah, totally. That's actually, you know, I think we're sensing here that there are lots of different ways that PR manifests in the world. And like, as someone who ended up more in like the kind of creative agency strategy side, one thing that I loved about like starting in PR is that you have that kind of like bullshitty brand speak. It's there in your head, but you have this kind of like incisive slice through it of knowing like, look, if I go take this to a reporter, or if I go take this to the world and they don't think about it the way you do, and they don't care about it the way you do, like we have to find a way to connect it to something that the audience like genuinely does care about. So I don't think that a PR thinker would ever pitch the Kylie Jenner Pepsi spot, right? Because it's like that, like there's no way that someone like super in tune with like what's going on in the world, how people around protests like think and feel, that spot would ever go to that place.
It's so funny you said that, because this cocktail festival, when the social justice movement happened, even though I knew the client had done like all the right things in the past 3 years, I knew that they probably haven't come far enough as far as diversity and inclusion on a global level for a festival that reaches 30,000 people annually. So I suggested preemptively that we contract somebody who's an expert in that space of diversity and inclusion and has like crisis comms background. And we ended up hiring this really talented woman who worked on the crisis comms for the Jenner Pepsi ad. So I should definitely put you guys in touch with her. Maybe she would be able to do a session on all things crisis, but they're brilliant. And it's been really fun to work with somebody who has like a very different skill set than mine.
That's amazing. We would love to talk to her. I guess part of what I'm wondering is, knowing that there are lots of strategists, lots of creative folks on this call, you know, is there a way that people could kind of hone that PR voice? Like, is there a way that you honed your PR voice? Is it just the media you consume, or kind of how do you put on that hat of like, look, guys, this sounds good in the brainstorm, but when we take it out to the real world, it has to run, you know?
I'm going to sound so lame right now, but the truth is that in my early PR job, you would have to write a pitch, bring it to your direct supervisor, and they would like old school redline it. And they would always redline it to be in their exact style. And I would do it. And it would be like a well-written, factually accurate pitch, and it would get 0 hits. And I would get so stressed, because the rule was like you were supposed to get 2 placements per client per week that were like of substance, not like a roundup. And I would be like, I don't understand. Like, the partner's editing this, like the senior account executive's editing it, and none of it was my style, right? And then eventually I just like did some pitches under the table that I didn't ask them to review, but I knew the facts were right, because I needed to find my own voice. And I think like that was the thing. The bullshit meter went off. People were like, this sounds really professional and tight, but like soulless. And then once I started talking to people like people, and was like, hey, I read this article you did and I really loved it because XYZ badass thing you wrote. I don't know you and I'm new in my career, but I'm working on this thing and maybe it's of interest to you. Like, honestly, breaking the rules and being true to yourself does work. Somebody once told me this rule: you don't pitch on a Friday, especially in the summer, because journalists aren't working, your story will never get told. Hello, that means the journalist that was getting 200 pitches a day is now getting like 50. So I pitched a story and I got a New York Times hit the same day. So I'm like, if you listen to the advice that you get all the time, you won't find your own groove. And you also have to know what works best for you. Like, finding your pitching time is like your magic hour. Like, you have to know when your brain works the best and it's most creative. And like, for me, that was the morning. So I just changed my schedule a bit. I was like, I'm going to pitch from 8 to 9 and there's no one in the office to get in my head and I can get in the zone and I can write. And then like, I'll do the email BS and the photo requests and things like that later in the day. But yeah, it sounds lame, but you have to write in your own voice, or like, I think a great writer will see through it.
Yeah, I think that's like great advice. Brandon, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you for your question, and I think you might be the last one.
Hi, I recall when you gave us a list of your clients / brands, Union Square Hospitality Group was on that list. And if I recall correctly, Daniel Myers, the guy who founded Shake Shack, was like part of that. And I was wondering if you ever got to meet him.
Yes, actually, this is a really funny story. So my like career bucket list of going out on my own was like get hired by Danny Meyer. It's not like an account that I really worked on in previous agencies. It was like always such a big dream of mine. So early in my PR career, when I was at Balton Company, where they moved me up the ladder really fast and really young, I was asked to go to Aspen Food and Wine, which is like, I don't know, it's like Jean-Georges and Daniel Boulud and like all these very fancy chefs cooking for you in the mountains. And it's like foie gras and truffles and like happiness and rainbows and unicorns. And a bunch of chefs stay out really late and they drink a lot of alcohol. And my boss decided that instead of flying from Denver to Aspen, which was like 45-minute flight, really turbulent, but often gets canceled due to inclement weather, that we were going to drive from Denver to Aspen. So on the last night, all my work obligations are done. I'm having fun. I'm drinking with a few clients. I'm drinking till 2 a.m. with a few clients. I'm drinking a little bit past 2 a.m. with a few clients. And I go to bed. But right before we leave the party, I find out that a bunch of flights the next day from Aspen to Denver have been canceled. And people, celebrity chefs, are without travel. Danny Meyer being one of them. My boss at the time offers to give Danny Meyer a ride with us to the airport from Aspen to Denver. We have to be in the car at 4:45 a.m. So what I thought was like a really good, it's just my supervisor, we're friends, it's fine, it doesn't matter, turned into Danny Meyer. I get really motion sick. I don't know if you guys have ever done the drive from Denver to Aspen. It's altitude, you get nosebleeds. It's like winding curves and turns. So I sat in the back seat basically behind Danny, and he was being very sweet and trying to talk to me as like the junior person in the car. All the while I'm trying not to throw up on him. And he made us stop to go get photos of the sunrise. And then he saw a fox and then he wanted photos of that. Like, this went on for 5 hours. And to this day, like, he remembers it, because if I post something about like setting the table, I'll DM him and I'll be like, I remember the foxes and the sunrise. But years later, his company ended up hiring us to open a bar, which their opening got delayed due to the pandemic, but they were a very new client for us, and one we're really excited about. And he's truly a class act. So one thing that'll help you in life, whether or not you care about food or not, is read Setting the Table. It's basically like the best book. Everybody who works for me or interns for me, I like highly recommend it. We've done it as book club. It basically talks about how like hospitality and customer service can make you better in business and in life.
Was that a plant?
Thank you.
Is that a what?
Was that a plant, or did you guys like coordinate that ahead of time, or you just have a story for every celebrity that we could?
No, that was actually just like a really, really good question. That worked out well. By accident. Edit that part out.
Okay. Well, except for that tiny little edit. I think, well, I guess unless there are any last minute questions, or
I actually have one more. Sorry to keep you guys held up. Just for some context, I've had some experience doing media, and oftentimes you have vendors provide us like free food at lunch. I was curious in the PR space if you've experienced anything similar.
Yeah, like kind of providing like free F&B. I mean, as part of representing F&B, we kind of do it all the time. It's like definitely a tactic to get out in front of people. And I think like, you know, whenever freebies are kind of for better or for worse, like a tool that we use in PR, and it's probably going to be a more scarce one in this climate. But yeah, if people are going to cover something or I want to get in front of them, I don't expect them to do a good job unless they've tried it. Like so many times I find it kind of creepy and weird if you end up on a placement of like a roundup of the best burgers and you know for a fact that that person hasn't been in to try it, because then you feel it's disingenuous on the writer's side, and that does happen a lot. So as often as we can give somebody the experience, whether it's sending a book or a product or, you know, any of those things, it definitely helps you do your job. Then you're showing and not telling.
Thank you.
Yeah.
awesome. Well, Gia, do you have any parting wisdom for us, or should we wrap it up?
Put in the hustle while you're young.
Yeah. Missed the boat on that one. Whoops. All right, guys. Gia, thank you so much. We will post the assignment in the subreddit later tonight. Goodbye.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you guys. I appreciate it.
I'm getting a lot of love in the comments now.
Oh, Alex has a question.
Where's it?
Sorry, Alex. I just saw that. I can stay on if you have a question.
All right, sounds good. It's like just a quick question. Like earlier on the call, we were talking about KFC and like how they want to be just like on the news every week. I was just wondering from like a process standpoint, like when is it that the PR team is brought in to the stories or to the campaigns so that you guys can know and start pitching early on?
Honestly, it's really different depending on the client. Some, like the more corporate ones, fully bake their plans and then kind of bring it to you, or work with a creative/ad agency that they paid a ton of money to come up with the campaigns. Then they package it up, put it in a brief, and bring it to PR. But if you work with smaller brands that are more scrappy, like the ones that I do, we're often at the table at inception, like coming up with those ideas together, because they usually want our insight of what we think will sell to different media outlets, what will be compelling, and they sometimes shift the activation or the campaign around those insights and thoughts. So in an ideal world, we have like a seat at the table from day one, and we're working alongside like creative branding and all of those arms. But sometimes we just have to like fly by the seat of our pants.
Nice, that's awesome.
Yeah.
I appreciate you taking that question right at the end, but thanks.
Sure. Thank you guys. Have a great night, everyone.
All right, guys. Take it easy, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.